1982. A single American mother arrives home from a regular day at work. She cooks herself dinner, tucks her children in bed, and retreats to her bedroom. All of a sudden, she is attacked by an invisible force, an entity. The attack is violent, predatory, vicious, sexual. After the attack, the woman is left bruised, shaken, and terrified. Terrified it might happen again, and terrified that no one out there will believe her. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of the ghost story and discuss one of the most disturbing, visceral, and violent of all haunted house movies, Sidney Fury's The Entity. Welcome back to the Evolution of Horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're joining us for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres across a number of weeks. We are currently in the midst of exploring the evolution of the ghost story, and this is part 8, in which, as the intro suggested, we are going to discuss The Entity, starring Barbara Hershey. This will be a spoilerific review. We will be talking about every element of the movie, including the ending. So if you haven't seen The Entity, go away and watch it and come back. There's so much interesting, meaty themes to explore within this movie. And not only that, when I'm joined by my first guest, we are going to be talking a little bit more broadly about the whole ghost subgenre, and we're going to be mentioning other movies such as The Others, The Shining, Under the Shadow, The Innocents. So there will be minor spoilers for some of these movies, but we won't be going into the nitty-gritty for any of them. Just kind of briefly talk about some of the story points and characters. So just be warned, there are a few minor spoilers for other ghost movies this week. But before I introduce my first guest, here are a few contact details. You can email us. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter, that's @evolutionpod, or on Facebook, that's facebook.com/evolutionofhorror. If you want to join the discussion group and meet other listeners, discuss horror movies, please do. That's called the Evolution of Horror Discussion Group, and that can be found on Facebook. We are now also on Letterboxd. Please do subscribe on Letterboxd to keep up to date with what movies we're going to be covering in spoilerific detail so you can make your own watch list and keep up to date. Okay, later in this episode, I'm going to be joined by the brilliant Anna and Olivia, aka The Final Girls. They're back to talk about The Entity in spoilerific detail. But first of all, as a kind of prelude to The Entity chat, I'm going to have a little discussion about ghost movies more broadly, specifically when it comes to female protagonists in ghost movies and the idea of the hysterical woman. There's lots of interesting stuff to talk about when it comes to the haunted house genre, particularly with The Entity. So to help me unpick some of these themes, I'm talking to one of my favourite people. She's been on the podcast before. She's everyone's favourite freudian cinephile, the fantastic Mary Wilde. Mary, welcome.
Hi, how are you doing?
It's very good, thank you. Thank you so much for coming back and joining me again.
My pleasure.
So what have you been up to? I mean, you've got some more really interesting, fascinating courses coming up, haven't you?
For your horror fans, they might be interested to know that I'm repeating my course on women in horror films.
Oh, great.
At the Hackney Picture House.
That's so cool.
That's 6 weeks, women in horror films.
That's amazing.
And they can check out the Hackney website. It begins in February.
Congrats. I mean, it sounded like it went really well first time round.
It did. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Amazing. And last time we spoke, neither of us had seen Mother yet.
Yeah.
What did you think of it?
I loved it.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. It was very controversial.
It was really controversial, and a lot of people really hated it, didn't they? And do you know what? It was one of the few films I've seen sort of in my adult life where I had a real visceral reaction to one particular moment, which we all know what that moment is if you've seen it. I was really, and actually people got up and left in the cinema. It was crazy. And, I think just to have a film that evokes that reaction is quite interesting. Really.
Yeah, and the pace of it, because at the beginning it's so kind of, so peaceful in a way, but calm. A little bit dreadful. Mm-hmm. And then some things are a bit off kilter, and then suddenly it just picks up this crescendo pace.
Oh my God.
And Aronofsky has said that he seeks to sort of represent the visceral, the sort of physical sensation of riding the Cyclone roller coaster in Coney Island.
Oh, right.
And he loves the kind of, the ups and downs and the extreme changes of sensation.
Yeah.
And Mother is such a testament to that.
It certainly has that. Yeah. And it's the horror of it's not just the overt horror moments, but it's the discomfort of these people invading your home, and it's just all of that is excruciating, isn't it? You know, Michelle Pfeiffer's character and all those.
Brilliant.
Amazing. Yeah. Fantastic. Now, what I want to talk to you a little bit about today is ghosts. Now, we have been talking these last few weeks about the evolution of the ghost story, different movies, different interpretations, different types of ghosts. But I'm really keen to hear your interpretation from a Freudian perspective on what ghosts generally in horror films mean. So I'd love to pick your brains about some of your personal favourite ghost movies, what they mean, what the ghosts represent. We're talking later about The Entity, so I want to ask you a little bit about that movie. But before we get into some of your choices, first of all, are you a fan of the ghost genre?
Well, I love all horror films. In particular, I think that ghosts in horror films, I can't help but think that, myself coming from a psychoanalytic background
of course.
and a Freudian perspective, when we think of even the definition of a ghost, an apparition of a dead person that becomes manifested in the living, typically as a nebulous image. And, we think of ghosts as being sort of phantoms, spirits, but also revenants.
Yes.
They come back from the dead.
Absolutely.
They return. And from the perspective of Freud had a really fascinating theory about repression and how when something is forced out of consciousness, it doesn't die a proper death. It doesn't you don't get closure from it. You sort of repress it because something about it evokes anxiety and discomfort. So the sort of unconscious then becomes this place where this anxiety then lingers in a kind of purgatorial state, never really resolved.
Yeah.
And so it prompts the subject to look again and take notice of it, take stock of it, and it sort of haunts the subject. And I think that the ghost in the horror film narrative is a sort of interpretation of what Freud talks about, the return of the repressed, where Freud believed that repressed elements are preserved in the unconscious and they are forced to reappear because it's something that actually the individual needs to take stock of in order to evolve. It's not a case of out of sight, out of mind. Something will always come back to disturb.
That's
and
interesting.
Even the way that he wrote about repression it's almost like horror literature. He said, for example, repressed memories are virtually immortal. Decades later, impressions of past events behave as though they had just occurred. What is forgotten is not extinguished, but only repressed. Its memory traces are present in all their freshness, inaccessible to consciousness. So it's kind of interesting the way he talks about things kind of forever re-emerging. And when they do return, they're uncanny. They're sort of undead. But they're actually not the original object. They're sort of duplicates. And they're sort of, in a way, abject.
Absolutely.
As Kristeva says, the ultimate collapse between objectivity and subjectivity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's fascinating. And I think that's what we're realizing when we're watching all these films is that the ghost, depending on the era that it's made or that it's set, or depending on the nationality, the culture, these ghosts all represent different things.
Exactly.
They take different forms. So it's quite a malleable genre in a way, isn't it? But it's so true because actually there are so many. I think Britain is very well known for ghost stories, and a lot of them often take place in the kind of Victorian era. And of course, that was a very repressed time, wasn't it? Exactly. That's the thing. That is when people are living with secrets and people can't express what they want to express and all that kind of stuff. And that's where you get. I don't know. Have you ever seen The Innocents?
I have.
Obviously, there's loads to say about that. And again, whether or not, and sometimes with a lot of ghost movies as well, there's the argument of, okay, are there really spirits, or is this is
it a hallucination?
Exactly.
Yeah, you're right. And I think that's the beauty of a ghost story, because you're always left as a viewer sort of in this ambivalent space, never really knowing whether this is the paranormal or some kind of unconscious manifestation of the individual, some hallucination, some psychosomatic thing.
Yeah.
And there does seem to be a pattern of female-centered ghost stories. And I don't know whether it's, all the myths about feminine intuition and this kind of almost like a sixth sense, this sort of unspoken ability, and how women are often socialized and conditioned to be more comfortable expressing their emotion.
Yeah.
And so in a sense, the realm of emotion then presents possibilities of memory, and memory is connected to the past. And ghosts are very much sort of signifiers of the past. I think there may be some connection about emotionality and this kind of vulnerability almost. That just for reasons of conditioning, social conditioning and social construction, men haven't always had that sort of leeway into that world. They haven't always sort of been socially allowed to explore that realm of themselves. So I think, and I think it is kind of fascinating because I think I take that as a positive sign, because I think it means that women have that kind of vulnerability that is actually a strength.
Absolutely,
that gives them,
absolutely. And it's often obviously the film is saying that the woman is right and everyone else is wrong. That's
exactly.
the thing.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. You're right. Especially in a film like The Entity, for example.
Yes.
Your creature is a symbol, Carla.
A symbol of what?
I don't know yet. Maybe we'll find out. Could be a specific person, a fear of someone, a design.
No, I'm not hiding.
Suggesting.
I'm not hiding from anybody or anything.
Carla.
It's kind of interesting because with Barbara Hershey's character, this woman who's tormented and sexually molested by an invisible demon, she feels the assault taking place, but no one quite believes her. She swears it's taking place.
It's a really disturbing movie, isn't it?
Disturbing.
Yeah. I just watched it for the first time and I was like, wow, taken aback by it. Yeah.
What I find fascinating in that film is that ultimately, when she really is taken seriously, is by a team of parapsychologists, and they perform this experiment where they do a mock-up of her home.
Yes.
And this is all done in a sort of experimental setting to lure the entity into a trap where this kind of liquid helium freezes it and destroys it.
It's like something out of Ghostbusters.
It is totally, But I couldn't help but think that whole experiment had maybe a reference to the psychoanalytic process, because in psychoanalysis, in the clinical setting, the subject is sort of guided by their analyst to revisit their home life. So in a way, they're creating a mock-up of their home life inside their mind. And they don't use liquid helium, unfortunately. It's not as fun, but they do isolate the energy inside this inner structure to try and kind of recreate events that might have been traumatic in a safe space. Try and revisit. And you're right. I mean, it is about having faith in the person who is communicating that distress.
Yeah, it's kind of are they the unreliable narrator or are they reliable? And it differs from film to film. But definitely with The Entity, I think we're supposed to believe this is really happening to her.
Carla, let's talk about your visitor friend, okay? Your visitor fantasy. Let's take a good look at him. What do we know about him, Carla? Come on, let's use your words. What do we know about him? We know that he is big. We know that he is strong. It's frightening how strong this guy is. Isn't it? You told him unbelievably strong. So why does he need help? But he has two helpers, right? Two little ones, right? Those are your words. One big one and two little ones. Billy's a good-looking kid. He's a strong kid.
You're obscene!
Wait a second, you're having trouble with Jerry and...
You're obscene!
Carla!
Calm down, I'm not here!
Carla!
And it's really interesting because, especially with The Entity, you've got these two groups of people. You've got this guy who is the psychologist, and he kind of ends up being portrayed as kind of the bad guy in a way, isn't he? He's because he doesn't believe her and he just wants to kind of lock her away in a cell, essentially. And it's really funny. It's interesting. I'd like to hear, because obviously you come from a psychoanalytic background, and they're portrayed as being on the opposite ends of the spectrum. You've got the paranormal people, the team, and then you've got on the other side the psychoanalytic team who are saying no, it's all in your head. It's really interesting, isn't it?
It is interesting. Sort of trying to pit these two different professions against each other, because the psychologist is trying to kind of in a sense apply the scientific method and go by logic and reason, whereas the parapsychologists are telling her lady, we know you're onto something.
Yeah.
We've got the technical equipment here with us
Yeah.
to help you, and we're going to follow your lead.
Yeah.
It's kind of, she's much more autonomous in a sense, and much more
Yes.
empowered in the second scenario, where it does end up to come to pass, and there is something there.
Yeah, and there's that moment, isn't there, where she it becomes overwhelmed at the fact that somebody believes her. She breaks down because somebody believes her.
Yeah, it's really
horrible.
emotional.
It is really emotional, because also you could take away the supernatural aspect and just think, okay, this is just a story of a rape, and the fact that no one believes her. And it's a horrible.
It follows the same parallel.
Yeah.
Very effectively done.
It's great.
What do you mean, Anne? What happened?
Mummy went mad. Nothing happened. Yes, it did. No, it didn't. Yes, it did.
Be quiet. What's going on? I want to see those plates empty in less than a minute. Is that clear?
The Others, the Alejandro Amenabar film from 2001, starring Nicole Kidman, about a woman who lives in a darkened old house with her 2 photosensitive kids, and she becomes convinced that their family home is haunted.
Yeah.
Without giving anything away of the film, because it is quite exciting to find out the twist in that one.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
What I love about it is the topographical representation of the mind, and how, because of the presented reason that the children are photosensitive, they are forced to live totally in the dark.
Yeah.
But this then creates this sort of visual metaphor for the darkened unconscious, the inner world that is sort of so removed from the light of consciousness. So it is this kind of enclosed inner space. And within that, something is present.
Yeah.
Something torments. And I just love how it's such a simple, in a way, very simple story, but the ghost element in The Others is it just works very beautifully as a topographical representation.
It does, yeah. It's a really beautiful film, that movie. I think that's another one that's very underrated.
Yeah.
And I think maybe because it came out around the same time as movies like The Sixth Sense.
Yeah.
Also known for having a big twist and ghost.
Yeah.
And I think this one kind of got a bit buried, for some reason. But
it's very subtle.
It's very subtle. And that's the other thing. It's slow, isn't it? It's a slow burn. I love that about it. And it is very, very similar. You can see the influences from movies like The Innocents, can't you? Just in the look and feel.
And also the kind of absolute denial. The sort of existing almost on autopilot with a very strict schedule of activities during the day.
Yeah.
And so all of these things are set up so that to prevent any type of confrontation with the truth.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And so everything is sort of done and very deliberately, and to exist in a kind of state of a very defended state, constantly using these defense mechanisms to look away.
Yeah.
But it's fabulous because I think that the ghost, the ghost trope, in a sense, works as this kind of light that pierces through the denial of this darkness.
Yeah.
So I love that, how poetic it is.
It is, yeah, absolutely. And also there's a strong element of religion.
Yeah.
There's Catholicism in The Others, isn't there? She's this very kind of pious Catholic.
Very in control.
And very in control. And again, I think that really then kind of, there's torment there inside her as to whether or not she should believe in ghosts. Because if so, what does that mean in terms of, do you go to heaven or hell or get stuck or whatever?
Exactly.
And,
the afterlife.
Yeah, the afterlife. Exactly. I was talking to Kevin Lyons from the BFI, and he was telling me about, I think he said, the reason that the ghost story has always been with us in a way. These other subgenres kind of come and go, like slashers or whatever. They're kind of a boom and then they fade. The ghost story has kind of always been popular all throughout cinema, and I think it's intrinsically everyone is scared of death and is scared of the unknown and doesn't know what is going to happen to them after death, and that fear will never go away, essentially. Yeah,
and that preoccupation fuels this type of representation in film.
Yeah,
because there is that curiosity, and funnily enough, for someone in that character that Nicole Kidman plays in The Others, because she's so religious and she has very set beliefs about her convictions and the afterlife, etc. And And in a way, it's like the way that they organize their life without giving anything away. They are kind of stunted. They're neither here nor there.
Exactly. They're stuck, aren't they?
Stuck.
Yeah, they're stuck
They're
in this
stuck.
house that's surrounded by a fog. They basically can't go out, you know.
Exactly.
Yeah, they're in limbo, essentially.
They're in limbo.
Yeah.
This purgatorial state for me is a very good definition of potentially where the ghost sits for me.
Yes, yeah.
This sort of place of, ideally, if we think theoretically, if one dies, their spirit, you might believe nothing happens, but if you do believe in spirits, you might hope that they're released and they ascend to a better place. But the ghost sort of suggests that doesn't happen.
No.
They linger around because there's something unresolved. They have to communicate something, but because they're no longer subjects, they resort to other means of communications, distorted means.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
appear nefarious.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose there's a lot, you mentioned earlier, the uncanny.
Yeah.
There's a lot of the uncanny in ghost stories, isn't there, I suppose? Because like you say, they kind of look like us, but they're not quite us.
Yeah. That sense of familiarity that is on the one hand reassuring, but also it's no longer that person. It's something else.
Yeah, because for me, the scariest ghost stories are those ones where, like The Innocents again, where you just see a figure of a woman standing in the garden and it doesn't look like anything, but because it's so masterfully made, you are terrified by that image,
And in fact, there's a very interesting paper that Freud wrote called The Uncanny, Das Unheimlich.
Okay, yeah.
I think it was published in 1919, and he was really interested in, of course, having lived himself in Victorian times, these kinds of preoccupations that people would report, like, oh, I think I saw someone who looked like me, but it wasn't, it wasn't like anyone I knew, or it wasn't a family member, and it disturbed me, and he would often get complaints or people saying, his patients saying they think they saw a ghost or something, like he would, so this was something that fascinated him.
That's really
he would love the horror genre of film. If he were alive today, he would love it.
He absolutely would. Do you think that is it possible to be, have you ever believed in ghosts, or have you ever thought that you've seen a ghost?
I don't believe I've ever seen a ghost, but I do believe in paranormal stuff.
Do you? That's really interesting, because again, I was wondering whether if you were somebody who was a scholar in psychoanalytic theory or psychology, can you be both?
I think I do, only because I don't know. I'd like to think that psychoanalysis is a kind of roadmap for the soul, for our spirit, for our inner life. And it sometimes, maybe only because of the existence of dreams and how mystifying they are.
That's
and
how
perplexing. I'd like to think that there's something else that we don't quite know yet how to understand, but potentially,
yeah. Fantastic. Any other movies that you think might be worth mentioning in terms of kind of what the ghost means or represents? Because I know you've got Under the Shadow.
Yeah, I was just going to mention
because that's a really interesting one. Because another thing that we've talked about on this podcast is the way in which ghosts differ from culture to culture.
Exactly.
You've got Japanese horror of things like The Grudge and The Ring, and obviously you've got the classic kind of British Victorian horror. You've got the American sort of poltergeist, and that's a kind of different thing as well. And we've got this, which is very unusual. We've got an Iranian ghost story. One of the best horror movies of the decade for me. Absolute masterpiece. Yeah.
So good. So masterfully done by Avin Manshadi.
Yes.
2016, about a mother and a daughter who struggle to cope with the terrors of post-revolution, war-torn Tehran during the 1980s. At the same time as also being confronted by a mysterious evil that begins to haunt their home.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting, I'm part Iranian.
Yeah.
And just to start off by commenting on the title of the film.
Yes.
Under the Shadow. It's a direct translation of the Farsi sort of, not proverb, but more like a kind of turn of phrase.
Right.
That is... In Farsi, it is zire saye, and this is something that's employed in sentences. For example, often, if when it comes to children, you might hear people say زیر سایه مادر پدرت بزرگ بشی, which means, sorry, that's very convoluted. It just means we hope that you grow up under the shadow of your parents.
Oh, interesting.
Now, this doesn't have a negative connotation at all. It just means that it's more said in a comforting way, as in we hope that your parents are always there to give you a sanctuary, to kind of protect you.
Oh, interesting.
So the way that it's employed here as the title of the film, as a double meaning, is interesting because, of course, it's the little girl's father is at war.
Yeah.
He's fighting in the war,
yeah.
in the Iran-Iraq war. And so she's there with her mum, who's pretty much housebound. I mean, they never leave the apartment because of the bombings.
Yeah, it's actually very similar to the others, isn't it? You've got this war, this husband gone off to war, and it's, you know, there's definitely parallels.
There. Yeah. And so it is fascinating to me because it's sort of pitting those, maybe kind of using the ghost story and the horror genre narrative as a kind of communicative device for the experiential reality of war, how it actually feels to be in that kind of very dangerous zone of trying to survive with a child.
Yes.
Your support network is just, you know, eliminated. Everyone in your building is vulnerable. You know, there's all kinds of chaos outside.
Yeah.
And then inside, there's a ghost.
Yes.
There's some really evil, dreadful force tormenting you. And there's a lot of jump scares in this one.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And they call it, don't they? They call it, what's the thing? Is it jinn? The kind of what is the jinn? Because that was something that's never really obviously made clear, but you kind of get it. But is that something that is inherently part of Iranian sort of culture? Or
jinn is a Middle Eastern term, which means, I want to say ghost. It's not quite ghost. It's kind of like it's more like a kind of sort of like a more like an evil sort of apparition. It's sort of much more, it's ghost might sometimes imply something a lot more comforting, reassuring, or mysterious. This is much more like terrifying, frightening.
Okay. Oh, interesting.
And the jump scares for me throughout the film, in a way, they sort of parallel the experience of I guess being in a situation that's familiar in your home, but you never know at what time you're going to hear sirens. You know, you never know when you're going to be evacuated. You never know. There's always something. You know, you have to.
You don't know if a missile's going to come through the roof, or you know, it's true. It's similar to being at war, I suppose. It's that kind of feeling of bombs going off, gunshots, that kind of thing. Yeah, it's a really terrific film. There is kind of layer upon layer in that movie, isn't there?
Because also her relationship with her husband. It's kind of like there's some complexities there. So you kind of realize that, yes, of course, at first you think there is this kind of idyllic family, and it's sad because they've been torn apart because of war. He's fighting in the war. But throughout the kind of over time in the film, you realize that there's not everything is perfect inside that relationship.
No, absolutely.
So
and again, it's that idea of kind of a woman trapped in a either family she doesn't want, or you know, maybe she's not got necessarily that maternal instinct that she should have as a woman or as a wife. You know, it's that kind of thing. She wanted to pursue an academic career.
She has conflicting desires.
Yes.
And she has to kind of, in a sense, enter into this scenario and read out a script that doesn't chime with her inner, sort of goals and objectives for herself. That's why I find particularly the scenes of her exercising and doing the aerobic, Jane Fonda.
The hidden videotape that is like illegal.
This contraband kind of videotape. It's so 80s, like so iconically 80s, you know? But in a way, like she's so dedicated to her workouts. In a way, that's absurd. Like throughout this whole absurd situation, this chaos, she still perseveres with her kind of like, you know, quite impressive
and it's because it is like a westernized thing, isn't it? It's like the way that she goes out and gets herself arrested because she takes off her headscarf and everything, and she'd still rather do that than follow the rules.
In a way, it's an act of defiance, as you say. Exactly. Really, and I love how that's weaved into it.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant. She's a fantastic character. And it's really interesting because when you look at kind of the evolution of a lot of other subgenres, the way that, for instance, zombies have changed to kind of reflect whatever's going on in the world. And the same with slashers to an extent. With ghosts, there's less so of that, I think, actually. They've kind of stayed pretty classic the whole time. But what is interesting is that you can take situations like 80s Iran and actually compare it to Victorian England in some regards, and that kind of thing. So,
because there's certain repressive forces that are kind of universal, and they might manifest themselves slightly differently throughout different cultures, but the underlying sort of control is sort of prevalent. Yeah.
And I think another really interesting one is The Shining as well, because, I think a lot of people don't even necessarily think of that as a classic ghost film or haunted house film. And it's more like, I suppose a little bit like what you said about, what Freud said about kind of memories lingering or something, isn't it? Because there's a moment when the caretaker says something about, if something bad happens, it leaves a trace of itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's this really interesting moment where he does talk to, I believe it's the bartender inside this kind of reception hall in the hotel, in the Overlook Hotel. And I think it's actually called the Gold Room, which is interesting. And I don't think this is a deliberate reference, but Freud talked about something he referred to as screen memories, which he said were things that his patients often remember. There were these innocuous, quite banal memories, like, I remembered my uncle wearing that green sweater, but I don't know why I remember that. And he keeps kind of coming back. Freud hypothesized that this little detail is actually a screen memory. It's a sham, sort of not really evoking the trauma, but it's sort of linked to a trauma, and that's why it persists in memory. And he said screen memories are not golden, but they're not made of gold, but they're laid beside something golden. And the Gold Room inside, obviously the hotel, I think it's this kind of realm of possibility of events that are related to a trauma that the kind of quintessential spirit of the space cannot quite articulate and remember. It keeps evoking revenants from that trauma. And this Jack Nicholson's character is all caught up in that. And I find it interesting that he happens to be this kind of aspiring writer who is suffering from writer's block. And the fact that he's taking this job, which he seems to, believe is beneath him. He's just taking it because he needs space to write. And space and time. And he's struggling. He's really struggling. And this is interestingly pitted against the incredible ability of his young son, who might not be able to read and write perfectly, but he can communicate with ghosts. And he has visions from the past and the future. So it's kind of interesting because it's sort of placing this child in this paradoxical position of having this enormous communicative ability compared to his father, who's a grown-up, and yet he can't
see anything.
He can't see anything, and it's infuriating, and it sends him on a kind of violent rampage. And it always comes down to, it is a ghost movie, but it's also about this. It is a ghost movie. Under the Shadow, it's a ghost movie, but it's also about war. The Shining is a ghost movie, but it's also about an alcoholic father. And there's always an other reason for why this could be happening, isn't it? Which is so interesting about ghost movies. Because it just means that there's more and more layers, and the ghost, ultimately, I think the ghost trope in cinema is never really about the ghost. It's about it's a vehicle to communicate something that otherwise would be difficult to communicate. And that can be anything, and that's what's so satisfying. And that means that also that this particular subgenre of horror films is so diverse.
Because when you take something like The Entity and how kind of violent and aggressive it is compared to a lot of other ghost movies. I wonder if maybe that's why it didn't do as well or something. It's just not quite the ghost movie that people expect in a way, People don't expect to see kind of sexual violence or something.
In a way, though, like even just the concept of what happens in The Entity with the Incubus. When we think of what the Incubus is, it's a demon or some ghost sort of entity in male form. The female form is the succubus. But this entity lies upon the sleeping individual to torture them. It's this kind of positioning interests me because it's sort of like, it's not just some kind of like, maybe benign, innocuous entity sending signals in a very subtle way. This is something else. This is like, the subject might have run away for years and refused to confront.
Yeah.
And now there's no place left to run because this thing is now just on top of them. It's bearing down on them.
Yeah.
And there's no route to escape anymore. It's a kind of final attempt at confrontation, but it's a very violent attempt.
Yes. Yeah.
So in a way, it takes this team of parapsychologists, this support network of people who believe her and who have the sort of knowledge and capabilities and technology to confront this thing.
Yeah.
And I love that. I love how it sort of evolves in the story.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It is really fascinating. I mean, and right now, I feel like we're back in a place where ghost movies are very, very popular again.
Yeah.
These kind of The Conjuring, Insidious, Annabelle, all these types of like, we're over the sort of torture porn phase, and we're back in this kind of PG-13. I mean, what do you think that has any relevance on anything? Is there a particular reason why at the moment audiences are yearning for ghost movies again, as opposed to the kind of violent torture porn stuff that they got during the sort of, I don't know, sort of 10 years ago? I mean, I don't know.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I think it's probably a testament to the sophisticated sort of knowledge of and the evolving knowledge of the horror film viewer, and how we do need that maybe more extra dimension of sophistication.
Yes.
In the style that the story is presented to us, and the fact that I don't know, I think it's also a testament to the cinematic medium and how just going to the cinema is also quite ghostly. I don't know how to describe it. Like, particularly like the act of like going into a theater and it's a darkened room and then you see this specter on the silver screen, this flickering light. And I think there's something about that process that is sort of quite mesmerizing and it's quite captivating. Maybe in the same way that the experiential reality of seeing a ghost might be, kind of transfixing.
That's so true, actually, because it's that you're burning images of people onto celluloid. And I imagine back in the old, when cinema first began, that must be what it felt like, because until then, if somebody died, you'd never see them again, apart from maybe in a photograph. And suddenly you could look at dead loved ones again, living and breathing and talking and walking, but it's not really them. But so I suppose it is something that is actually very connected to cinema.
And I find that fascinating from a psychoanalytic point of view, because I think in the history of the unconscious, the birth of cinema must have been revolutionary for people.
Yeah, can you imagine?
Yeah.
It's getting your head around that thought that, when people saw that train pulling into a station that they all ducked, and and the idea that you've never seen a moving image on a screen before is incredible. It's hard to get your head around now at this point in time. But amazing. Well, do you have a favourite, just out of interest, favourite ghost movie?
Ooh, I think my favourite, I have to agree with you. I think Under the Shadow.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Only because it's so it's original, and it's something that I've never seen out of Iranian cinema before. And I think I really hope to see more from this director. I think it's really exciting.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much again for joining me, Mary.
Thank you
and
so
just
much.
Again, for people that are interested in coming along to any of your courses or anything, where would they find details of that?
The best way to keep up with my events is to visit my Twitter. My handle is @Psychstar. That's PSYCSTAR. And I should also mention, in addition to the courses I mentioned earlier, I'm also teaching a course at CityLit on sci-fi.
Oh my God, amazing. What kind of sci-fis?
So I'm calling it Outer Space as Inner Space.
I'm
going to be talking about films connected to sort of aliens, dystopian societies, the topographical representation of space and how it might represent our inner life, that kind of thing.
Amazing. 2001?
Oh, yeah.
I was going to say,
Absolutely.
It must be. That sounds like 2001. Fantastic. Amazing. Well, thank you so much,
Thank you,
Mary.
Mike.
A big thank you there to the brilliant Mary Wilde. And don't forget, if you want to check out any of Mary's courses or upcoming events, please do follow her on social media. Her details will be in the show notes. Okay, well, we've talked a little bit more broadly there on the ghost genre, and we've touched upon the entity, but let's get into the nitty-gritty. Let's dissect this movie in depth. You're now going to hear my chat with the brilliant The Final Girls. Now, I came and chatted to these guys at the BFI. Just a word of warning, as with before, there are three of us kind of sharing two microphones, so the sound is a little bit distant compared to what you're usually used to, but hopefully I've made it reasonably coherent. Here is my chat with Anna and Olivia. Okay, this week I'm back with Olivia and Anna from The Final Girls. Hello, guys.
Hi.
So lovely to have you back. First of all, just for people who may be listening to this for the first time or don't know anything about you guys, tell me a little bit about you, who you are and what you do.
Cool. I'm Olivia, this is Anna. You can't see us, so that makes no difference.
This is just a standard introduction that she's perfected.
It just comes out of my head. It's really bad. We're The Final Girls. So we're a film collective that explores the intersections between horror and feminism. We've been putting on events for almost 2 years now, looking at kind of the representation of women behind and in front of the camera.
You've done that before?
Just once.
Just a few times. Brilliant. Last time you guys were here we were talking about slasher films and Slumber Party Massacre and all of that kind of thing. We're now sort of talking about, the kind of more the supernatural end of things, ghost movies, hauntings, that kind of thing. What's your general opinion on those types of movies on that kind of end of the spectrum of horror?
Oh, personally, I love supernatural horror.
Yeah.
I find it a lot scarier actually than slasher films because they play around with belief systems first of all.
Yeah.
Whether you are religious or not, or whether you believe in an afterlife or not, just the idea of there being something that is post-human or that doesn't or that maybe lives in another realm and that can kind of infect our reality is so scary because it's unknown and it's uncontrollable as well, and there aren't any hard and steadfast rules as well that you can abide by. Like if a killer with a big knife runs after you, you can try to kill him or run away.
Yes.
That's what you need to do. What can you do with a ghost? So that kind of the new mythology that every film can create as well is really exciting because it essentially creates new reality rules as well.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think out of all the kind of subgenres, I find it probably the scariest at times, but also sometimes the most disappointing. Yeah,
controversial.
I know.
Interesting. Why disappointing?
Well, I think it's scariest because of exactly what you just said about that idea of. And the film we're going to talk about today, The Entity, is actually really relevant of that, of what would you do in that situation?
Yes.
And fear of the complete unknown, often what you can't see. Where I find this genre problematic is when they try and kind of explain it too much. They go into that world and they're like, oh, let's let you see this thing. And then
totally.
I always find that kind of a complete anticlimax, and it's like, oh, cool, that's not what it looked like in my head. Now I'm not scared anymore.
Yes. But it's really interesting because actually in some ways out of all the subgenres though, this is the one I would say that does that the least, that shows you the monster the least. And that is, for me, why it is the scariest, because I suppose that's the problem with a lot of the ones these days, is that they do eventually. The third act becomes, let's just throw all the monsters at you and things. But previously to this, we've been talking about movies like The Innocents, The Haunting, M.R. James adaptations, and The Shining and stuff like that. And I think what makes them all so terrifying is that you don't know what the fuck is real and what isn't, and what's psychological and what isn't, and you're picturing everything kind of in your head, I suppose.
It seems to be this weird thing in the modern day now that it's cool, it wasn't enough for someone to use their imagination, we have to kind of give them an image of that thing. And actually, I'm going to be controversial.
Go on.
The Nun.
The Nun.
I'm so not looking forward to The Nun.
Yeah,
because it over-explains
because I don't need to see it.
Yes, well, this is the problem with these James Wan, these Conjuring movies. They're good fun. They're kind of jumpy. They're roller coaster rides, but they don't really get under your skin. They don't stay with me after I've seen them. After I leave the cinema or walk out.
Okay, clearly none of you have seen a oil painting of the nun in an I know, but
that's what's terrifying. But then I don't need to see the actual
the origin story of the nun.
It's the over-explanation. It's there's this one intriguing, terrifying character, be it a ghost or it's a demon in in the Conjuring universe. But why do we need to know the backstory? I don't need to know that. I can imagine it. It's scary enough to not know where the nun comes from.
Exactly.
I don't need to know whether a nun was a real nun in Portugal in the 18th century or whatever. I really don't want to know that.
No.
That said, I will still go see the film.
Oh, I want to see the film. I'm upset. I love James Wan so much.
Oh, do you? Oh, well, fine. But actually, and I think from the one clip I've seen of the nun, it looks more creepy than some of the other Conjuring movies to me. It's got that kind of old-fashioned, like, almost like the Witch style kind of look to it.
What was the prequel that they've just received? The Annabelle prequel.
Annabelle
Creation.
Annabelle, I hadn't seen it.
That worked really nicely, actually.
I've heard it's a lot better than the first Annabelle. I haven't seen it. Yeah, I haven't seen it yet. So what about this movie? I mean, because I thought of you guys for this movie because you have screened it as part of the Final Girls and everything. I mean, what was it about this movie that interested you and made you want to sort of get it out there?
Well, like Livia mentioned before, one of the things that's really scary about this film is that it's never explained. Like we'll talk about the kind of the specifics of the plot in a bit, but actually the ghost element of it, there's no reason why it appears, and there's no reason kind of explained. It's not, you know, the lost soul of a previous enemy or anything like that. It's just kind of a random series of attacks on women. So the fact that it's never kind of clarified, but it's still incredibly violent and incredibly terrifying, makes it just crawl under your skin so much more because of that. If there was, you know, a sequel that explained why the entity became the entity, it would have completely lost its power. And we screened this film July last year.
Well, actually, it was going to be our second film ever originally.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Originally, this was going to be our follow-up to Trouble Every Day. It didn't happen for lots of reasons. So eventually we screened it last July as part of Cinema Rediscovered. Sorry, it came out like a year after Poltergeist, but sort of faded away. And not a lot of people have seen it. And I actually hadn't seen it until we talked about screening it originally a couple of years ago. I've now seen it about 5 times, and I
regret every single one of those.
It is the one film that really gets under my skin.
Yes, it's really disturbing.
I find it so uncomfortable to watch and really upsetting to watch.
To put it into context, we always we love sitting into those events that we do because one of the reasons why we wanted to do this when we continue screening films is because we enjoy the cinematic experience, the shared experience in a cinema with an audience. We could not sit through The Entity.
No,
so we wanted to, and then we chickened out. And then we just sat outside the cinema at the Cube in Bristol and just... It was still torture because the music of the film is so thumping and so incredible.
The music of this film, if you've not seen it, is just so powerful. It's just like these huge thumps, but it's so aggressive.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Yeah, so we just sat outside the screen of the Cube cinema being like, we're going to go in 10 minutes. And then this thing in the background just going boom, boom. Oh. And we're like, and we're just going to sit outside. And then everyone came out and they were like, looked absolutely traumatized by this film.
They didn't want to talk to us after that.
I mean, it is, again, like the movies we've been talking about in this kind of subgenre so far have been very restrained, you know, like there's not really anything on screen that is that graphic, violent, sexual, anything like that really. The point of these movies a lot of the time is just that you don't see anything, or it's all sort of repressed or suppressed. But this is the first movie really that's I guess a kind of ghost movie that is really like hard, strong stuff on screen.
Had you seen it before?
I had never seen it before with this podcast. God. I've now watched it twice because I remember the last time I spoke to you guys and you mentioned it and I hadn't seen it at that point, so I've watched it for the first time over the last few months, and it's horrible. It's really horrible, but incredible. I'm really surprised that it's not as well known as it is. In a way.
Was a timing thing of when it came out.
Yeah, because it was actually made in 81, so it was ready in 81. But I think Poltergeist came out the same year, so it was internationally released in 82, and then domestically, so in the States, in 83, to kind of put a little bit of a distance between them. But I think at the time they capitalized a little bit on the success of Poltergeist.
Yes,
but wanted to position themselves as well as sort of the thinking man's Poltergeist. Yeah. So whether it's Poltergeist that's accessible, scary, the entity is we're gonna lodge ourselves in your brain and fuck you up for a scary.
It's not safe scary, is it? That's the thing. It's not mainstream scary.
It's really not.
You know, around this time you had a series of big hitting ghost movies that were all scary, but they were all kind of accessible. So you had Amityville, and then The Changeling, and then The Shining, and then The Fog, and then Poltergeist, and it's like, and then there's this film which is something very different.
20th Century Fox presents the story of Carla Moran, the most extraordinary case in the history of psychic research.
Everything broke loose and went crazy, and everything was shaking, the bed was shaking, and the walls were shaking, and...
Like an earthquake?
No, it wasn't like an earthquake. It was much stronger than any earthquake. Oh, wait a minute. Honey, I don't really understand this. You were attacked? Or you weren't? It happened. I was raped.
You were raped by whom?
I don't know. There was no one there.
A team of experts will investigate her life.
Why does he attack you, Carla? Not anyone else. Why is she going to such lengths to support this delusion?
And they will find more than evidence. They will find the entity.
So the entity is based on the true story of Doris Bither, who was a woman in the 70s in California who was allegedly kind of attacked by an unseen entity, a ghost or poltergeist, for years and years, basically until the end of her life. So she had to keep running away to different cities and different houses with her children to try to get away from that. And it's Barbara Hershey stars as Carla, so it's inspired by that story, but it's not attempting to be an exact recreation of it. And in fact, the director, Sidney J. Fury, has kind of gone on record saying that he kept away from the real life story because he did not want to influence his own characters or judge them in any way based on what he could read or know about the real life case. So Barbara Hershey is a single mom, and in the film I think she's got 2 children.
She's got 2 children, which is quite prominent, which I'll come back to.
Yeah, and essentially, completely randomly, out of the blue, she is attacked in her house, in her bedroom, when she's alone at night, by this sort of unseen force that essentially assaults and rapes her. And this continues over and over again, and she tries to seek help. She goes to
her boyfriend,
her
she goes to a psychotherapist, she talks to friends.
She goes to the police.
Yeah.
Her children don't believe her at first until her oldest son witnesses one of the attacks. She accidentally, in a bookshop, kind of trying to find books about the paranormal and the occult, bumps into 2 psychologists or parapsychologists, and they take an interest in try to prove what she's saying effectively. And one of the things why we were interested in the film and why we wanted to talk about it is because the actual horror of it is not just the vicious attacks of an unseen ghost. It's the fact that there's this woman who goes to every single institution, every single societal kind of support group, and her own closest people, her friends, her partner, her children, and she's disbelieved continuously and just either mocked or called crazy, or her own livelihood and life is affected by that.
Yeah,
because she's constantly just not believed.
Yeah, what's really interesting about this film is actually at the time it was kind of, and has like continually been looked at as this kind of like almost misogynistic piece of work.
Yeah,
like,
it's so interesting.
Yeah, it's quite graphic. Like the prosthetics in it are incredible and also really terrifying what they do with her body.
Essentially what Olivia's talking about is like there's scenes where she's assaulted. Some of them, because she's in her house, in her bed, sleeping, she's naked, and you can see these invisible
like
kind of
forces on her body and moving around. It's really horrible.
It's literally like an invisible man on top of her.
It is like clawing away on her. And you know, I think there are a lot of scenes that really don't shy away from her discomfort and these horrible, uncomfortable things. They don't, cut away or anything like that.
It doesn't give you an out in any way.
And it goes on and on and on. It's a quite long film. It's a 2-hour film, and you constantly go back to these really long, drawn-out scenes of her just being attacked. But what's really interesting about that is, and it feels so timely now about this film, is like a woman who's, going through this abuse that she doesn't quite understand, and trying to tell someone, trying to get someone to listen to her and understand that, and no one listening to her.
Yeah.
Even when they're confronted by it, I think one of the most harrowing, human and harrowing scenes in the film is actually when her partner, so she's single mom, but she's got this kind of steady boyfriend, and their position is, they're not super young. They're probably in the mid-30s, and her partner is kind of an older man. He sees this. He sees her being attacked by this invisible force, and he is so scared by it that he leaves her instead of trying to help her.
Yeah.
So she's abandoned effectively by almost every single kind of potential source of support, except her children and this one psychologist who's trying to, in a very almost selfish way, trying to prove that this entity exists so he can make a name for himself, but also to help her.
Yes, exactly. It is horrible, isn't it? And, you know, all the men that you think to begin with are going to be on her side then turn out not to be a lot of the time. You know, there's the main character, what's his name, of Dr.
Snyderman?
Yeah, Dr. Snyderman, who Ron Silver plays, who is just quite a horrible, grotesque character, isn't he? The way that he sort of treats her and dismisses her throughout the movie.
Let's say a man who wanted to be good had a desire for his neighbor's wife. He knows it's wrong, he feels terrible about it, but the desire is growing and growing. Desire can be a very frightening and powerful sensation. How does he deal with it? He invents a creature. An evil, ugly, evil-tempered creature, which is just a picture of his own desire, Carla.
I have no need of inventing anything.
Come on, Carla, stop it. You have a lot of need.
I think it's sort of like interesting as well. Like if you look at the sort of beginning scenes and the beginning shots of the film, it's like you see her and she's actually a very kind of active, independent woman, isn't she? Like the first sort of 5 minutes of the film is like little like fast cuts of her working and studying and doing this and doing that and making her own way and having her own life. Get back, look after her children, put them to bed, and then it's like bam,
it's
and then it's like
10
puts a
minutes
stop
of the
to
film.
that. Yes.
When I rewatched it the other day, it's something like minute 11 or something, and it's just like straight in there. And from that point onwards, it's such a claustrophobic film because you just are so sort of up close and personal with her all the time in this kind of really sort of like aggressive thing in your senses. Sort of, you know, we talked about the sound, the music. But just this...
It's also the invasion of her space.
Yeah,
it's the fact that she's built this life for her. She's got her work, she's got her house, she's got her family. But this manages to penetrate that as well. It's like, we're going to get in your house. And should we talk about the ending as well?
Yeah, we do. I do a little spoiler warning.
So at the ending, at the end, after... she's kind of confronted in a big sort of experiment where they rebuild her house in a way and trying to freeze the entity.
I think that's true.
What did they did that?
The gymnasium scene is true.
Oh.
Yeah, so I was reading this earlier actually. Like, there are a lot of things in the film that actually are very similar to what happened. There's a lot of things that are a little bit different for various different reasons. But that is a scene that someone just wrote, you know, they're so lucky that happened in real life because actually you just wouldn't believe that was the case, otherwise it's nuts.
But there's this, so when she comes back home after this whole ordeal in a sort of, you know, cathartic, like this has finally ended type moment, the entity speaks to her for the first time and it just says, welcome home, cunt. And all she can do, and it's kind of a really, I think a really empowering kind of final moment, despite the fact that she's constantly persecuted, is that she just gets her stuff, gets her kids and goes. Yeah. Because that space that she had created for herself is no longer safe. Yeah. Once that entity is in there, and he just will not, it will not leave. Yeah, I know. It is like, it's chilling, and actually I think that they're all arguments against the fact that this film is just a misogynist, exploitative thing, I think. You know, like, it's interesting because me and Michael Blythe were talking as well about, you know, a lot of the things you get in this subgenre, and with all horror, I suppose, a little bit, is this idea of the kind of hysterical woman at the centre of it, who is often, these ghost stories are, the woman can see the ghost, the woman knows about the ghost, but nobody believes her kind of thing. And sometimes, in some of these older ones, they can be a bit cardboard cutout-y. But what do you think of the way this character is portrayed in this movie and the way Barbara Hershey plays her? I would actually say she's playing to that archetype, but also she's not behaving that way. She's not hysterical throughout the film. In fact, she's one of the most kind of sober, balanced people. Yeah. She speaks about her ordeal in a kind of really, you know, as real physical assault, which it is for her. And we see that, so we're kind of on her side. But when the moment I think where she breaks through, when she finally gets someone to believe her, it's this kind of real relief, I told you so, I told you so moment where she feels such relief. It's like, I've been telling you this for ages. This has been happening and you finally believe me. But it's not a hysterical moment. No. She never goes hysterical throughout the whole film. In fact, she's very, very kind of calm and collected, especially given what she's kind of been put through as well.
I think that's quite a purposeful decision that was made as part of the creative process of this film, because actually the real life character was a bit more of an unbalanced character. They say that she had certain addictions and alcohol, and she was having a lot of troubles at the time. But they really don't portray Barbara Hershey as that. They portray her just as kind of, you know, your regular struggling mother who's just dealing with kind of everyday life things. And I think that actually is an intentional decision to not perceive her as like any kind of thing of like,
there are moments in the film, particularly with Dr. Snyderman's, with Ron Silver character, where he tries to force that hysterical woman on her, where he goes, oh, you know, you're a single mom, obviously you're unstable.
It's like, oh, you must be having a hard time, you must be imagining
because
that a ghost is
work
raping
and
you.
have a family and a house at the same time, so clearly you're insane. You know, there's these moments where people try to force insanity or kind of hysteria on
and
her.
she questions herself as well. There's a scene with her friend where she's actually saying, you know, am I actually going insane? Am I imagining all of this? And it's kind of to the point where so many people are telling her, no, this can't be true, that she does begin to question her own mental state.
There's that horrible moment in midway through where she kind of just submits to that idea. And it actually happens right near the moment where she is lying in the bed, and that moment where she has the orgasm, and again it's like kind of like submitting to this like giving up kind of moment. And I think that is the most disturbing moment in the whole film for me, is that bit where she's in the bed, because it's just like, it's so kind of raw, isn't it? She sort of bears all at that moment.
Why did you tear up your room? Why did you yell at Billy?
Like that. Orgasm.
What?
I had an orgasm.
An orgasm.
But he tricked me. I was asleep. I was asleep and I was dreaming. And I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed.
I mean, like, how do you think the men are portrayed in this as well? Because it's really interesting, because, you know, this idea of like, I was reading an article about it. Obviously, there's this whole kind of theme of sort of an invisible man, and actually a lot of the men in it are quite invisible. You know, the husband of the friend, and even her boyfriend, who's absent for the first half of the film, and that kind of thing. And then you've got, like, you know, like you said, Dr. Snyderman and this whole boardroom of horrible old white men in suits all deciding what to do with this woman and that kind of thing. I mean, like, how do you think they're sort of portrayed?
I think it's interesting about you kind of coding the entity as a man, because we don't actually know how to gender it until the end, where this demonic kind of male voice says the kind of welcome home kind of bit. But at the beginning, it's just, throughout the whole film actually, it's just this thing. You know, even the name of the film, it's like, it's the entity. It's not a ghost, it's not a poltergeist, it's not even positioned within kind of the framework of haunted or ghost films. It's not being called, this is, you know, the soul of a whatever wronged fisherman or something like that, or this is your ex-boyfriend who killed himself coming back to haunt you. No, it's just this invisible thing that's haunting her for no clear reason. It's a completely random aggressive entity. And so then you don't even know what it is. Is it human? Does it have a past? Like we were talking before, the scariness of it, part of it is the fact that you don't know what this is or why it's doing it. And then, but going back to the men in the film, I think you can generalize, or it does seem like a specific creative way of portraying them as much more self-absorbed and weak than she is, because one of the things that, again, one of the reasons why I think this film cannot be misogynistic is because she's such a emotionally strong character. She goes through all of this torture. She's made to doubt herself by the people closest to her and by figures of authority, doctors, policemen, whoever, and she still maintains, this is my truth, this is what actually happened. And when she finally does get believed, she grows so much stronger, and in fact she goes so strong within herself that she confronts the entity head on, and she will not be tortured by it anymore, and she just declares that, and that's the only thing that kind of alleviates the pain that nobody else has been able to do for her. Whether it's the men, they're always in it for themselves. Dr. Snyderman is in it because he wants to, you know, make a great breakthrough by being the first psychologist to discover, you know, something from beyond the grave or something kind of paranormal, and to prove it and capture it. It's not about so much helping her as it is helping his own career advancement. Her boyfriend is at first disbelieves her, so clearly he doesn't even trust his own partner's word, and then just runs away when he actually is confronted by the reality of it. So he's weakling. And
I think that's like a really conscious decision, because one of the things that, like, a lot of kind of articles on this film talk about, you know, it is through the male gaze. It's a male director who's directed this kind of very personal female-led story. And it does feel throughout that there is an active decision throughout the entire film to look at these men, and in a way that it's kind of like, look at the way you're treating this woman.
Yeah, 100%.
You know, and look down on them in the fact that it's unbelievable that you're completely ignoring her and that you are weak characters, and you're extremely selfish and self-absorbed people. But it seems like an active decision through his personal choices of this film to make sure that she is always portrayed as this kind of strong person who's really persistent and she never gives up, and and just this almost heroic figure in this film who continues in this horrendous situation to persevere.
And going back to that final scene that I mentioned before, and kind of the hysterical woman archetype, the final scene, just to kind of describe it in a really point way, she comes back home, she closes the door, and she's sort of relieved because this is after her confrontation with the entity in the gymnasium / experiment where they try to trap the entity, and she hears the voice, welcome home, or welcome back, cunt. And she super calmly does not change her expression, does not break down crying, does not freak out. She takes her stuff and she leaves, and then we have kind of text on the screen saying kind of what happened next. But that sort of calm self-assuredness, almost potentially, you could read it as resignation, as of her realizing, I'm going to have this thing in my life for the rest of my life and carry on with it. But she's incredibly strong because she knows that as long as she is in control in a way, I don't think I think the element of control there is slightly different and much more nuanced than what I'm talking about now. But if she is the one who is in control of her destiny and not allowing that thing to enter much anymore, allow it to overpower her and her perception of herself in reality, it can't hurt her that much. So she's definitely kind of, I think that's a really that end scene in particular.
It's like, I can't get away from it, but I'm going to learn to manage this.
Exactly.
Yes,
and I'm going to learn to live with it in a way that not suits me, but in a way that I have some kind of control over.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because you're right as well, that kind of decision to make her then walk out of the house and drive away, it could have ended on welcome home, cunt, and just her stood alone in the house and cut to black.
Or just, breaking down crying.
Exactly.
Or something even worse, the easiest possible thing they could have done is just, oh, I'm never going to run away from this, I'm going to kill myself. So effectively she is, if she died, if she was kind of punished, or if she gave up because of this thing constantly torturing her, I think that would have been such a much weaker ending.
Totally.
Definitely. Do you think that the film believes her? Like, do you think that it is definitively saying this is not psychological, this isn't an
I think it does. It really, really does. I think throughout the entire time it is this kind of like this woman who's struggling to be heard, and her version of the story is completely true, and we should dismiss everyone else who doesn't believe her because that's awful. But I think it very much
and
is
it's very interesting as well that from the very beginning, like, these are kind of creative directorial choices. We see the assaults as the audience, we see them happening, but also I think because I refuse to rewatch the film again for this. I'm sorry.
No, I can't. Totally fine. I know what you mean.
I remember how the assaults are portrayed escalating in terms of how explicit they are. So I think the first one, you can't tell whether there is someone else or whether there's just nothing there and it's just kind of an invisible entity, and then it becomes much more graphic, and then other people are allowed, other characters are allowed in a scene where they see this happening as well.
Yes, there's the moment when her children see it.
Exactly, her children see it, but they talk about it originally it's like one entity, and then she talks about her feeling of being like held down by other forces as well, as though there's kind of more than one thing there, and it kind of escalating in that way as well.
But we're always with her as the audience, so we're in the universe of the film. We see this happening, and then we see her trying to confront the real world to explain this. So I think we're very clearly positioned kind of on her side. Like, we believe her because we've seen this happen to her.
Yes, unless it's that we're so closely aligned with her, it's that we're seeing what she's seeing, and we're experiencing what she's experiencing. But it's a tricky one. But I think you're right. Other characters see it. There's obviously that whole sequence at the end with the liquid mercury or whatever it is, nitrogen. So I think it is. But it's just interesting because they do also feed you all these little things of she was abused when she was younger, maybe she's had this happen. There's obviously this kind of trauma going on, and they give you just enough of it, I think, don't they?
I think there is another, I think I might have read a review or two where there is a different reading of the film as well, of like being an exploration of the manifestations of trauma and how can that linger and how can that come back and affect adults or years and years after any sort of abuse or trauma have happened, how that can affect everything, and how it's also very difficult to be believed or to find the right help or the right support to not even, or whether it's even possible to get rid of it, because she never does. So it will just continue, but as you said before, it can be a manageable thing. So that's another reading to the film that I find interesting as well.
Yeah, definitely. And what about the cinematography as well? Because it's Stephen H. Barham who's done a lot of people like Brian De Palma's movies. Even actually when we were talking about slashers, we talked about Body Double, and actually it's a very kind of quite leery, sleazy movie, to be honest. But do you think that this movie has a kind of... is there anything about the cinematography and the way she's portrayed that is particularly kind of male-gazy or leery or anything like that?
I think it's often perceived to be kind of leery because it lingers on those scenes for such a long time.
A couple of the assault scenes are a bit leery.
They are, like the particular key one that I can think of where, as we were talking about earlier, you can see him sort of like on her breasts. And stuff. They have the prosthetics.
So you can kind of see indentations in her body, and that's very extended.
Yeah,
so
like
that's
her
very
as a naked presence is, it's left on screen for quite a long period of time.
But they do focus, a lot of the shots are close-ups of Barbara Hershey's face. So
yes,
it's very much,
I thought. Yeah.
So it very much kind of goes to her experience of it, and like we see the violence of it, but then it's very much on her face, on her reaction, and that kind of continues throughout the rest of the film. So you have kind of these close-ups of her as well when she's in her daily life trying to confront it, when the entity tries to kill her by trying to derail her car when she's driving, like how she's managing this situation kind of goes very, very, very close up. But I think the main scenes would be the assault scenes. That can be interpreted as a bit leery, the way they're shot.
Problematic. It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because ultimately, I don't think it's just so uncomfortable. Those moments just make you feel even more uncomfortable because of it, and maybe that was the point. But it's a tricky one to debate, isn't it? In a way,
I think that also comes back to the constant debate of, with difficult subject matters, and particularly with assault, do you show it in a really terrifying, horrifying, explicit way, or do you shy away from it?
Like, what would that film be if you didn't see it? And would that, would you be with her as much if you hadn't been experiencing these hugely traumatic scenes for such a long period of time, to the point where you're so invested in, like, this is such a horrific experience that you just kind of, egging on in a way for someone to actually believe her? And would you feel the same way if you actually hadn't seen that to such a certain extent? Would your mind be kind of going, oh no, this could be something else? She's obviously just a bit crazy, or there's something weird going on in the family. So
it's a weird one, isn't it? And just talk to me again briefly about the music, because we mentioned it very briefly at the very beginning. But the music's pretty intense, isn't it?
It's like from the start. I mean, we talked earlier
Anna
about...
looks traumatised just thinking about it right now.
Yeah, we talked earlier. It's not a soundtrack you want to buy, basically. I mean, from the start we talked about, the first assault scene being straight on in that film, and it's just this like hammering, constant, like it's almost like an orchestral kind of scream coming at you, and it makes you feel as though, if that was like us watching it outside, it was like you can feel everything vibrating, and it's just uncomfortable.
It's just like someone thumping you on the head repeatedly.
Yeah, but less so than kind of like a slasher sort of. It's just very.
Yes, like kind of visceral and guttural.
The composer for this was Charles Bernstein, who also did Nightmare on Elm Street, another terrifying soundtrack.
Yeah, so in a very different kind of way. Yeah.
So this is the man who is responsible for my nightmare.
And he's just sitting like playing those things. It's like, oh, I've come up with this great tune.
Yeah, so weird. And of course, Quentin Tarantino has stolen that bit of music from The Entity as well. He used it in, I think, Inglourious Bastards, when Christoph Waltz is coming after people. But I mean, it's interesting because I think a lot of directors have recognised this film as a classic.
Well, Scorsese called it one of the scariest films of all time.
Exactly, it's in his list of, I think, his 10 scariest ever movies. It's really interesting then. So you guys, like, it's funny because you both said, you didn't want to have to watch this movie again. Like, and yet you did want to show people this. You took it to cinemas. You've shown audiences. 100%. So, is this a film you would recommend or not?
Yes, 100% is. I'm so pleased that this has finally got a Blu-ray release. It was like last
it was
year,
released
Eureka.
just before we did the screening by Eureka on Blu-ray.
But it is a film that's like, I talk to people about it, and it's so interesting from so many different angles, because it's much more than just like a poltergeist film. There's so many different layers to unpick in it, and I think it's a really important piece of work. And not what I watch.
But that's always a compliment, you know. Some of this, you know, particularly with horror, if something is so traumatic that you can vividly remember it. You can remember scenes and dialogue and music and particular bits and pieces of it, but you don't want to watch it.
Exactly.
I've watched this film 3 times. I think that's more than enough for a lifetime. Same as with Inside. I've watched the film twice.
Inside.
I don't want to watch it
that
ever
with
again.
Martyrs as well, and it's like it will always be in my head. I don't need to watch it again.
No, it's like someone says The Entity, and I'm like, not anything tonight.
Oh, guys, I'm so sorry. I'll put you in a room on your Saturday and make you talk about this film in depth.
But we really wanted to screen it, and because we wanted to talk about it, and we wanted to reposition it, because it's one of those films, you know, because of when it came out, because of kind of the hubbub surrounding the actual real life case, and because of how lost it became, just via, you know, marketing and kind of coming out in a time where there was a lot of really successful ghost and haunting and poltergeist films. It seemed relevant, and it seemed maligned in a way that, you know,
timely with what's going on right now.
I mean, that's going to be our
but
other
we
question.
did screen it before that.
We did, but
well, you guys are ahead of the curve. That's what it is.
I know, but like, you know, this is like 30 plus years ago, and it's dealing with like a subject that's so topical now, to the point where that is terrifying. And I think actually the fact that it did get re-released last year, and people have a little bit. It feels like people have a bit more of an awareness of this film. Maybe we've just been talking a lot about it.
I think it's coming back to. I think we talked about this last time when we spoke for the previous season of Evolution of Horror, that horror, one of the great things about horror films in general, and one of the things why we love it so much, is that it can talk about incredibly difficult taboo subjects through a kind of a more creative way, and through film without it's very explicit what this is about. But you don't bring someone in to watch a film about an assault victim trying to get believed. You bring them in to watch a poltergeist film or a ghost film, but this provokes thinking in people, I think, and 100%. That's the really powerful thing about horror.
I mean, it's almost crazy really that it is included in the same conversation as movies like Poltergeist, because that is such a kind of almost family-friendly ghost movie, you know.
Family ghost film.
There's apart from the fact that they're both about quote-unquote ghosts, there is nothing similar about these movies really. That's the crazy thing.
In fact, the director, when he eventually released this in the States, he wanted to separate it from Poltergeist, which was the obvious comparison. And
and you can see marketing people going, oh, Poltergeist,
great,
Horror marketing is a whole nother ballgame. It's interesting. I find it so interesting. That's another season.
Absolutely.
But what was interesting, that he wanted to position it as a supernatural suspense film. Which is intriguing.
Yes, that's right. He said in an interview a few years ago, he doesn't even call it a horror film. Supernatural suspense film, which is interesting.
Those people you saw in the house, they're psychologists, they're doctors, and they have a theory that there's something in the house that is keeping me from sleeping, and they're trying to fix it.
I mean, Barbara Hershey, that is one of the bravest performances, you know, you could
give.
She's
incredible
so
performance in that,
as a performer in general.
She absolutely
and
has
the
to bear
ordeal
all.
she would have had to go through filming that particular role.
She is incredible.
Absolutely incredible. So you would recommend a watch once kind of deal with this movie?
I commend you if you can watch it again.
Yes.
If you don't have to.
I think it's an important film, isn't it, above all other things as well?
Yes, it is.
Wonderful. And then, guys, just before we wrap up then, I mean, what is your favourite ghost movie, favourite haunted house movie, that kind of thing?
I'm obsessed with Kiyoshi Kurosawa.
Oh god, here we go again.
She rolls her eyes. I'm obsessed with him. For anyone who doesn't know, he's a Japanese director, makes like what I think are some of the best films ever. But he makes some really interesting, I guess, horror type films. Pulse being the most well-known film. For me, he's just like Pulse, for anyone who doesn't know, it's the story of a group of friends, one of them commits suicide, and then eerie happenings.
We're going to be covering it in a couple of weeks'
Are
time.
you? Cool. Who are you doing that with?
Rosie Fletcher from District 9.
Yeah.
We're going to be sort of doing J horror, K horror, and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for me, he is just like a master of atmosphere and suspense, and what he does framing wise of not relying on jump scares for things to be creepy, but more that putting things in your view, which makes it more terrifying in a way. Yeah. And if anyone hasn't seen that, please do. And also Seance of his is really incredible.
I've not seen Seance.
Oh, Seance is amazing.
Is it?
And Sakabi as well. I'll just continue listing.
Okay, good.
I'll just be like,
all right. All of his films. Yeah. Good to know. Anna, what about you?
I'd say probably I always really suffer when I'm asked these questions.
Yeah, I know. It's a ridiculous question. I know.
Friendly Ghost.
No. No, I'd probably say The Changeling.
Yeah.
It was creepy and terrifying, and also, frankly, kids are scary. Ghost kids are the scariest.
They are the scariest. From the Innocents onwards, it's like creepy kids are such a huge part of these movies. Yeah.
The Changeling's one of those films that if I ever see the DVD in my cupboard, it just brings back memories, and I'm like, oh god, so it's now like shoved to the back.
Yeah. So the way I saw it, I did not know. I just grabbed it from my university library, and I was like, oh, it's a horror film, yay! I did not expect that.
Yeah.
Also, watched it by myself in an empty house and in an old, kind of empty, creaky house, and it was not the right time to see it. I swear to God, I saw ghosts after that.
It is. It's terrifying. I was we talked about it a couple of weeks ago. And when I was editing the episode, I put all these clips in of The Changeling and stuff, and then something happened, and my laptop came on in the middle of the night in my bedroom, and I suddenly heard this. Like this, like kid's voice in the dark when I was asleep.
Oh, that's
absolutely.
That's gonna happen to you with The Entity.
Yes,
with
exactly.
The
yeah.
Oh,
truly
that's
chilling.
Horrible.
Yeah, horrible. Thank you so much, guys. Just tell us again. Have you got anything coming up, or any details where people can find out what you've got coming up?
Yeah, so we're working on a couple of bigger projects right now that we haven't announced yet. But in March, as part of the BFI Girlfriend season, which self-plug, I've co-programmed. We're both introducing Cat Cheese Poison Ivy on the 11th of March, which will be screening on a 35mm print as well. It's
on the 9th of March.
Okay, well,
yeah, on the 9th of March. But it's amazing. Anyone who hasn't seen this like film, it's worth it alone for Drew Barrymore's Red Suit.
I'm obsessed with this film. I want to resurrect this film. It's directed and written by Katchi. It's a very, very young kind of teenage Drew Barrymore playing a kind of teenage temptress, but there's a really interesting and obsessive female friendship at the core of it, and it's an erotic thriller from the 90s that it's not really seen as an erotic thriller in many ways, and it's really, really kind of has a lot to say about female relationships, about female sexuality, about burgeoning female sexuality, and about class as well, and how we deal with that, particularly with very kind of young teen friendships as well. And it's on 35 minutes.
Absolutely. And where can people find you guys sort of online, social media, that kind of thing?
We're at thefinalgirls.co.uk or at thefinalgirls.uk. We're on everything, Twitter, Facebook,
We're not on Snapchat.
We're not on Snapchat. Maybe we shouldn't get Snapchat. Every now and again we go loose on Instagram stories, and that's not enjoyable for anyone else but us, I think. So.
Yeah. Keep away from Snapchat. Thank you so much, guys.
Oh, thanks so much.
Thank you.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to my fantastic guests from this week, Mary Wilde and The Final Girls. Don't forget, if you want to check out any of the events that either Mary or The Final Girls have got coming up, please do follow them on social media. All their details will be in the show notes. So, what did you think of this week's episode, and what did you think of The Entity? Please do get in touch. I love hearing from you. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter @evolutionpod or on Facebook. That's facebook.com/evolutionofhorror. If you want to discuss the podcast with other listeners, please do come and join the Evolution of Horror discussion group that can be found on Facebook. And please do subscribe to us on iTunes or whatever podcast platform you use. And if you get a chance, leave a little rating or review. It's really, really helpful for me, and it helps give the podcast a boost. And on that note, I'm going to give a quick shout out and a thank you to everyone who has left me a wonderful 5-star review in these last couple of weeks. So a big thank you to the brilliant SH Brew, The Kit Kat Man, Meza SS, Steve Last, Junglist Jim, Van Hoggs, Spooky, Max Renz VCR, Greg Ninja Costa, RoddersJ04, and Top Film Podcast. I don't know whether your iTunes name is Top Film Podcast, but that's all it says. So either way, a big thank you to Top Film Podcast. And don't forget, if you want to give us a little review, I will give you a shout out and a special thank you on the podcast very soon. So next week, well, this week was a bit of a heavy one. I mean, The Entity is a brilliant movie, but not exactly a fun movie. And I think it's time we go back to something a little bit more light and a little bit fun. In fact, these two movies that we're going to be covering next week are possibly two of the most fun movies we've ever covered on the podcast. You know, you could even argue they're not even, strictly speaking, horror movies, although I think they are, and I think they actually have some very scary moments in them, as well as being incredibly funny and just incredibly fun. So next week we're going to be reviewing two classic 80s family-friendly ghost movies. The first will be Ghostbusters from 1984, and the second will be Tim Burton's Beetlejuice from 1988. Cannot wait to discuss these movies, two of my all-time favourites. And joining me to discuss these movies is one of my very good friends. He was on the podcast way back when in episode 1, and he's back. The brilliant Rob Watts. So join me next week for all of this and more on the evolution of horror.